You wanted the best. You've got the best podcast. The hottest podcast in the world. The Chris Voss Show, the preeminent podcast with guests so smart you may experience serious brain bleed. The CEOs, authors, thought leaders, visionaries, and motivators. Get ready. Strap yourself in. Keep your hands, arms, and legs inside the vehicle at all times, because you're about to go on a monster education roller coaster with your brain. Now, here's your host, Chris Voss.
Hi, folks. Chris Voss here from the ChrisVossShow.com. There you go, ladies and gentlemen. There, ladies, things that makes it official. Welcome to the big show. As always, the Chris Voss Show is the family that loves you, but doesn't judge you, at least not as harshly as your family. So there you go. As always, we're bringing you the most amazing authors and people on the show who write the most amazing books, the hottest things that come off the shelf, from novels to politics to fiction, nonfiction, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists, CEOs, billionaires, all the wonderful people are on this show, and bring it to you, 2 to 3 shows a weekday, 10 to 15 shows a week. If you're not paying attention, listen to every damn show, don't make us come out there. Anyway, we know you are because you consume 96% of it. But what's with cutting out at the 4% end? Is it because you're doing rounding out the show? Is that what it is? And you're just skipping the next show? Don't do it. I might say something interesting in the last 4%. Anyway, guys, we have an amazing author on the show with his debut book. It's called The Wolves and the Greyhounds, a novel of the Great War. Came out March 29th, 2024. Robert Schreiner is on the phone. He's on the Zoom phone, the StreamYard phone. He's on the show with us today to talk about his newest book and everything went into it. And he has a very illustrious career that he pulls the wonderful stories and data from, I'm sure, to interweave his amazing new novels and the stories inside of it. Robert is a former CIA intelligence officer. After leaving the government service, he embarked on a subsequent career as a consultant and executive in the global private security industry. He is an avid amateur military historian who's traveled the world, routinely speaking in side trips to visit ancient fortifications and battlefields. He lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee, and his wife, two spoiled Cocker Spaniels, and an amusingly musical cockatiel. Welcome to the show, Robert. How are you?
Doing well, Chris. Thank you very much.
There you go. You got like a whole farm going on there at the house. You got the cockatiel and...
Oh, yeah. We've got all kinds of animals here, and yeah, they rule the roost for sure.
The Blue Ridge Mountains of Tennessee, John Denver. So, Robert, give us the 30.com so people can find you on the interwebs.
Yeah, it's robertschreiner.com is my website, and I'm also on the platform formerly known as Twitter, as well as LinkedIn. So it's pretty easy to find me. Just look for Robert Schreiner. I'll pop right up.
There you go. You know what? You know what? I just realized everyone says that on the show. They go, "I'm on Twitter, formerly known as Twitter," but no one says what it is, right?
I'm sorry. It just sounds so weird to say I'm on X. What does that mean?
You're like, does that mean blank? What does that mean? So, give us a 30,000 overview of your new book, The Wolves and the Greyhounds.
Thank you. Yeah, The Wolves and the Greyhounds is a military adventure, a military thriller set in the early months of the First World War. It's actually based on true events that inspired me to write it. And at the time, the two essential superpowers in the world were Great Britain and Germany. And everyone knows, about the British Empire, and that was really at its zenith at the time. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That was really that period of time. It was really an astonishing, network of colonies and, even, communications cables. And of course, the Royal Navy that kind of held it all together and protected it. The Germany under the Kaiser they had aspirations to essentially equal that, or even best it if they could. And Germany had a collection of colonies of its own across the world. Mm-hmm. They had colonies in Africa, they had colonies in the Pacific, in Asia, and the German, Imperial German Navy was, in this arms race with the Royal Navy at the time to try to, do the best that they could to protect their own colonies, but also match the Royal Navy's might wherever they would potentially encounter them. Mm-hmm. And the events of this novel take place right as the First World War was being declared. And what happened to kind of kick off these events was that the Germany's largest largest military presence, I should say, outside of Germany was their colony at Tsingtao, China. They had a large naval base there, and what was really their most vaunted naval detachment, which was the East Asia Squadron, was based there. Mm-hmm. And the Royal Navy knew, as war was about to be declared, they knew that they had to potentially bottle up as many of the German naval assets and military assets as they could. And so a task force from Hong Kong sailed up to Tsingtao to encircle the colony and bottle up the naval forces there. But when they got there, the port was empty. Oh, wow. The Germans had managed to sneak out all of their warships and all of the support ships, and they completely abandoned the port. What that meant was that, the Germans' most feared naval unit outside of German home waters was missing.
Loose. On the loose.
Somewhere. Exactly. And so the Royal Navy then embarked on this desperate search to find this naval unit before they showed up pretty much anywhere. They could show up anywhere in the world on, a shore, unbeknownst to the, whether it was a British outpost or a colony or one of their other assets. Mm-hmm. So the Wolves and the Greyhounds starts at this point where the Germans have essentially sailed off into the Pacific, and the British are desperately trying to find them. Mm-hmm. And it follows two naval captains, one British and one German. And the book attempts to tell this story from both sides as equally as possible. And so there's a British captain who's he becomes in charge of much of the effort to find them. Mm-hmm. And there's a German captain who is under the leadership of the East Asia Squadron's leader, who is Admiral Graf von Spee, who's actually pretty famous. Mm-hmm. The Germans named a whole number of warships after him. He was a legendary figure in German naval history. But he was also an interesting guy and kind of mercurial and unusual fellow who might be kind of unpredictable. And so this captain is serving directly under him. And so the story follows each of their individual story arcs as they are inevitably drawn together in this story.
Nice. So this is the sort of stuff that I really loved when I was a kid growing up. I loved the old naval battles, World War I and World War II, and Eisenhower and MacArthur, and all the Patton and all that sort of stuff. And I loved to build the ships, the model ships when I was a kid. And in fact, my brother crushed one behind the door. I'll never forget, on purpose. And this was just a really interesting time. Let's get into your background, and then we'll round back to the book. Tell us a little about your upbringing. I know you did some CIA stuff. What motivated you growing up to enter some of the things that you did? And then when did you know you were starting to write and become a great writer?
I actually grew up as a Foreign Service brat, and it's one of these stories that sounds like it's out of perhaps a TV script or something. Actually, both of my parents worked for the Central Intelligence Agency as well. They met there, and this was in the early 60s, and they were married, and I came along a year later, and that was when my mother resigned from the agency, and she then spent the rest of her career as a mom. And my dad went on to he actually retired as an office director within the CIA. And as part of his job, we traveled all over the world. And so I grew up in Europe and in Asia. Wow. Our main posts were in Vienna, Austria, London, England, and Bangkok, Thailand. And so that was my childhood. We traveled all over Europe. We traveled all over Asia. I mean, it was amazing. It was really an extraordinary childhood. Just an amazing opportunity. I mean,
and so many diverse sort of cultures.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And in fact, I sort of, I learned German at an early age. We were living in Vienna. I spoke with a pretty solid British accent when I was a school kid in England. I was immersed in those cultures, and we got to see so many things. Many of my childhood memories are, traipsing through castles in Spain or England or Germany or Austria or someplace, seeing amazing things, visiting battlefields like Hastings or Normandy or Waterloo, and that really sparked my interest in military history. And I was always interested in writing. So that started at an early age.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that must have been fun to go through. See, I was just having to build stuff at home and read books because we were in California. So there's not a lot of battlefields of World War I and II in California. I think in the movie 1941, they documented something with Belushi about the invasion of L.A. or something. I don't know if it's true or not. But so that must have been extraordinary. But the great thing about our lives and people who write novels like yourself or people who write idiot business books like me, the great thing about our lives is we're able to collect these stories and these fabrics of, different things that we're exposed to. And I imagine that was really helpful in helping build you into weaving this novel.
Absolutely. Having those experiences and being able to see things from someone else's perspective. I had friends from almost every nationality you can imagine growing up, and everyone else's perspective of not only modern, current events, but also historical events is definitely colored by their background. And so our perception of, for example, the First World War and the Second World War as Americans, very different than that of an English citizen versus a German citizen or someone who was living in Asia at the time. And so those types of things are really valuable to round out sort of a worldview and be able to put a different perspective on something when you're trying to write with a different voice, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. There you go. And so when did you finally sit down and start writing this novel?
I actually, it was sort of a long process. The initial spark for it was many years ago. I started writing it several years later, but I actually happened upon it when our children were in high school, and they all had the same history teacher 3 years in a row. They're all right 1 year after each other in school. And so they all had the same history teacher with the same project that was all about the First World War. And I was already, kind of a military history geek. I had lots of books about it. And so I was happily handing these over to the kids who otherwise would have rolled their eyes at anything that, Dad was interested in. But in this particular case, I was suddenly useful. And so I was able to give them some of these books. And as part of that, I'm going through them and kind of handing off things I thought might be helpful to them for their project. I happened upon this really brief one-liner about the Battle of Coronel, which was this naval battle that occurred in November of 1914. And I thought it was really interesting. Partly, I was this military history person, and I actually never heard of this battle. Like, how's this possible? And and the backstory to it, this amazing odyssey that the German East Asia Squadron had embarked upon at the beginning of the war to find themselves off the coast of Chile, which is where this happened, was just this, like, how could this possibly have occurred? So I that piqued my interest initially, and then years later, that it was still in my brain. And I thought, what, let me look into this. And I read more about it. And the more I read, the more I became convinced that this was a story that needed to be retold in a way that was more accessible than the average history book might give it that treatment. And so I thought, a novel would be perfect. I could tell this story from both the British perspective and the German perspective and fill in those gaps that might be in the historical record and really add some texture and depth to this. And that was really the spark. And it then took me several years to research it because, the adage, write what you know. No one living now was a naval officer in the First World War.
Joe Biden was.
Possibly.
No, I'm just kidding. I love Joe Biden, by the way. And so was the Rolling Stones.
Exactly.
Yeah, there you go.
So I had to become as much of an expert in this subject as I could. And so I got resources from the Royal Naval College and from the Hoover Institution at Stanford and UCLA, and I mean, just wherever I could get this information, I got it. And it was amazing to me and actually humbling and gratifying that so many people, when I contacted them, were interested in this project and were overjoyed to be able to help. And like, oh, absolutely, we have something. And they were dusting off things that hadn't seen the light of day in nearly a century.
Wow.
And I got copies of just amazing things, ship's logs and officers' journals and just extraordinary finds. And I got out of print books that some of which had been written in the 20s and 30s. And so that was part of the research journey. And that took several years. And just for me to be comfortable enough with the subject matter, for me to feel authoritative enough to write this from a a legitimate perspective, because I really wanted to do justice to this story.
Mm-hmm. And I Googled this, and they have pictures and film of this from this, right?
There are some photographs of the era, like right after the Battle of Coronel. There are some photographs taken of the German squadron, for example. There's a few photographs of some of the British ships that were involved. And so there is some historical record for sure.
There you go. I mean, quite exciting. And this is back in the day when, things were different. You didn't have the sonar, radar. I mean, maybe they had radar back then.
No, you're right. There was no radar, and so in fact, to someone who like the average person looking at a warship from World War I to a warship at World War II, they might not notice a whole lot of differences. These, the warships they're made of steel. They had turreted guns. They were, comparable size. But the warships in World War I, to your point, they didn't have radar. Mm-hmm. They did not have voice-to-voice radio, so they couldn't just key the mic and talk to the ship that was in their formation. Wow. They only had three options. They could use wireless systems, which essentially, if you envision Morse code, the captain, for example, who wanted to talk to his sister ship in the formation would have to give an order to the wireless operators. They would have to encode that, send that message to the other ship. That other ship would have to decode it, print that out, and then deliver it to the bridge of the other ship. Wow. And so you can imagine in a battle where seconds matter, if the message takes minutes to be delivered, that's not quick enough. Yeah. And so they also relied on flag signals, where they would run flags up the halyards, which that's really a method that's thousands of years old. I mean, really, you can think back to the time of the ancient Greeks. They were doing similar things on their ships. Mm-hmm. And then they also potentially use lamp signals at night, but those were extraordinarily primitive communication methods compared to what they had only 25 years later in World War II.
Did they have aircraft carriers back then where they could send up planes to?
Not yet. By the end of the First World War, by 1917, 1918, they were experimenting with that. Mm-hmm. But at the beginning of the war, in 1914, aircraft were still it was still an experimental idea to even use aircraft in combat. Wow. And they were mainly used for reconnaissance. And the idea of launching an airplane off of a ship would have been a fantastical concept at that point.
Yeah, so you didn't have any radar. You didn't have any, satellites where you could be like, where's the German fleet at? And where should we be at? And all these different, there's a picture here of somebody, I think this is one of the colonels from the Battles of Coronel and the Falkland Islands. This guy looks like the salt of the earth.
These were amazing people who did extraordinary things with what we would consider relatively primitive technology. Yeah. The other part of it is these ships of that era, they were still coal-fired steamships. Oh wow! They were all fueled by coal, which is a really heavy, cumbersome, messy fuel. And so a lot of time, these warship formations had to be trailed by colliers, big cargo ships whose holds were just filled with lumps of coal. And they would have to bring them alongside these warships, and they would go through this laborious process of moving lumps of coal from one ship to the other, and they would put them into these coal bunkers that, interestingly, the way that it was a brilliant design of the time, those coal bunkers on these warships were just inside the outer hull of the ships along the outside. So they acted as an additional armor barrier. If an incoming round managed to penetrate the armor, the next layer of defense was this layer of coal in the coal bunker, assuming it was still full of coal. Yeah. And so there were many accounts actually in the battles that are described in the Wolves and the Greyhounds. There are many circumstances where incoming rounds, both German and English, managed to punch through the armor, but were stopped by the coal bunkers, and they were able to continue to steam on. So it's a fascinating time in technology. So they're still sailing on these steamships that actually the technology in terms of, you think about steam engines and coal-fired steam, it really was reaching its pinnacle at the time. These warships, very large warships, were approaching like high 20s, almost 30 knots in terms of speed, which rivals modern warships.
Really?
And they were able to do this with steam engines. And so it really was something extraordinary for them to be able to do this at the time.
That explains why some president was trying to take us back to coal steam at one time. You don't have to do that with nuclear ships, right? You don't have to have the thing following you around to refill your nuclear.
No, you fuel it once and it's good to go for the life of the ship. That's right.
Good to go. That's the best way to go. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine I used to have these dreams. I watched all the movies of World War I and World War II, and I used to have these dreams of the Battle of Midway and all the ships and stuff, and it was always so fun to play with that in my head. I don't know if young men do that anymore. Do they? I think they have video games now. They have. Yeah,
I think video games have taken the place, but I did the same thing. I used to kind of play with all that kind of stuff, airplanes and ships and all of that, and it's that I think that kind of exercise of your imagination is something that video games have largely supplanted at this point.
Yeah, because you don't really have to imagine anything. It's just delivered to you.
Right, exactly. In amazing detail, too.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. But I like video games, but I kind of miss those days when you have an imagination, you get together with your friends, and you have the battle of whatever. And, there was always I remember growing up, what was the PT book with John F. Kennedy, his story of the PT boats, and, all just the craziness of that time was just fun. So the two captains in your book, I imagine it's historical fiction, right? So you're using different names, I guess?
No, actually, I warred with that. I really wanted to try to be as accurate as possible. So, and in the historical notes in the book, I certainly mentioned the fact that in many circumstances I used the actual names. Mm-hmm. But and so it'd be sort of like writing a book about Julius Caesar or Napoleon or someone who actually lived, but you're filling in the blanks, right?
Yeah.
And so in this particular case, I used the actual names for many of the folks who were involved in these battles. So this particular Captain John Luce was, in fact, the commander of HMS Glasgow at the time. And Captain Julius Merker was, in fact, the captain of SMS Gneisenau on the German side. And they were real people of they had these extraordinary lives. And we know something about them, but we don't know everything about them. And so that was part of my challenge as an author, was to fill in those empty spaces where we don't have perhaps a ship's log, or we don't know exactly what happened, but we can guess at their motivation. And we know in a lot of cases, we know what the outcome was, but how did we get there? Yeah. And so I had access to, in some cases, ship's rosters. I had access to some of the logs of some of the people who were involved. And they, some of those materials gave me immense insight into, how people thought, how they viewed these activities and these events at the time, how cut off they were from, their home, commanders, either on the side of the British or the side of the Germans, how isolated they felt. And so I did, in fact, use a lot of their names, actual real characters. I tried to find out as much about them as possible. Mm-hmm. And I humbly used them as characters in this book with the expectation that I might be taking liberties. And I apologize profusely for that in the historical notes.
I don't think they're going to call and say they're upset or write in maybe bad reviews on Amazon. So you'd be okay, I think. He misused my name, damn it, in World War I.
Exactly. Perhaps their great grandchildren might have an issue with it.
I think they would be honored to have their great grandparents, whatever, taken and done. What do you hope people come away with reading the book? Do you hope they learn something about history or great characters, enjoy the novel? Is there any sort of maybe some lessons you put in the book as a wink and a nod to anything? What do you hope they come away with when they read the book?
I certainly hope that people learn something from it. I certainly learned a lot in the process of writing it. That period of history, I think, in terms of naval combat, but combat in general, I think that when most people think about the rigors of war and the kind of grueling nature of warfare, a lot of that has been perhaps overshadowed by the Second World War and what happened at that time. But there are some certainly some of the deprivations that these folks went through during that period of time was, I think it's worth knowing about. I also thought in the process of writing it and listening, reading the actual thoughts of some of the participants, it was a different era in terms of how you viewed your enemy. And there was still some gallantry back in that day that I think we've generally lost. I think that in modern warfare, one of the first things that happens is that your enemy is dehumanized, and it makes it easier for you to kill them. Mm-hmm. Back in that era, that wasn't what was going on. I think that they viewed each other possibly as more alike than different. They just happen, if they're an enemy combatant in a foreign naval vessel, is probably more alike you than they are not, even if they speak a different language. Mm-hmm. And they shared different cultural backgrounds, but they also had these commonalities in their life experiences, and they really wanted to do the right thing. And that was one of the really striking things about this era and the story that I tried to portray was that they weren't demonizing their enemies. They were actually trying to treat their enemies with as much respect as possible. One of the typical things of the day was if an enemy ship went down, if you could rescue as many of the survivors as you could, you would absolutely go and do that. And you would treat them with as much respect and dignity as possible until they could be kind of shipped to they'd be shipped to a prison camp somewhere, but you would treat them, they were making sure they were fed, and they'd have tea and, warm blankets. And that was what was done at the time. And I think that that's something that is worth knowing, that, human beings, even when fighting against each other, could still be human. Yeah. And I think in modern times, you see the horrific stories of the Ukrainian-Russian conflict now, and some of the just horrible atrocities being committed. And it's just a wonder that one human being could do that to another. Yeah. It just doesn't necessarily have to be that way. And that was one of the things I really took away from my research and hopefully conveyed in this story, was that they treated things differently back then. It was a slightly different viewpoint on how you viewed your enemy.
Yeah, it was. I think Abraham Lincoln pioneered some of that. I mean, I think some of the rules that he made about prisoners of war and how to hold your enemies after winning in battle influenced. I don't know if it influenced much of it, but it seemed to be a time where we had a little bit more morality and backbone and things like that.
Absolutely, the Hague Conventions and the Geneva Conventions. There was a time where people paid attention to that. And I think that nobody cares anymore. And I think that's an unfortunate loss, especially when conflict seems almost inevitable. The fact that, one of the first steps in conflict is to dehumanize your enemy so that it's, almost nothing to kill them is really a terrible circumstance. Yeah.
You saw that in World War II with the Germans and the camps. And then there was the Japanese, that were, awful. Hanoi, Hilton, and
absolutely.
Vietnam, things like that. So yeah, just. But there's that. You kind of see that in what was that old great movie about the bridge over the River Kwai? Was it?
Yeah.
Yeah, and how the British officers tried to hold a decorum of decency and respect, and you saw how they tried to operate. And so there's a romanticism to all this stuff. Like I still love it. There's an old. I don't know if you've seen it, but. Imagine you have. There's somebody who's gone back and they've colorized the old movies from World War II, a lot of the German stuff. And seeing the colorized versions of it brings a whole new dimension to it. It really makes it feel, I don't know, I love black and white, but it really makes it feel like more modern or more real. Like,
right.
It's kind of weird to watch.
Right, you're right. I have seen some of that, and it adds this texture and reality that otherwise looks more like this historical artifact, where you can certainly much more easily imagine yourself in that scenario if it's in color.
And to me, it helped imagine the horror of it, because when you look at black and white, you're like, oh, that's something that happened a long time ago. I think you can disassociate from maybe a little bit, but when you see it in color, it just makes it be like, these people were as bad as some of us today, and things really haven't changed that much around here.
Yeah, no, I don't know that human beings have done a whole lot of evolution once we got done with evolution.
That's the one thing I always say on the show. The one thing man can learn from his history is that man never learns from his history. And thereby we go round and round. So give us your final thoughts on the book as we go out. Tell people the final pitch out, where they can order the book, and .coms, and where they can find you.
Certainly. No, it's available in most places where you can buy books. Certainly, Amazon is probably the easiest place. It's available in both paperback and ebook. but also barnesandnoble.com, and then in ebook format, all kinds of places. Apple Books, Google Play Books, Kobo, all kinds of places there. And in terms of .com, again, robertschreiner.com, and all of the links are there to find the book wherever your preferred retailer might be.
There you go. Thank you very much for coming on the show. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
All right, Robert. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Go to goodreads.com/Chris Voss, LinkedIn.com/Chris Voss. Chris Voss won the TikTokity. If you want to buy me coffee, because I just drank the one I had before me, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/Chris Voss. Thanks for tuning in. Be good to each other. Stay safe. We'll see you next time.